Hello? Oh, not you again.
Yeah, I know. I feel like I just made this video too. But here we are, back again, with evidence that sea level rise predictions might be underestimated. And in fact, even the best case scenarios of sea level rise might be overly optimistic. Sea levels have risen by 24 centimetres since 1880, with 10 centimetres of that occurring the last 30 odd years. But that could quadruple or even octuple by 2100, even at moderate to high emissions levels. That's according to this article that came out in April 2026. It focuses on the impacts of continuing emissions for sea level rise and puts it into terms that have implications for how fast we can adapt. Because the authors show that sea level rise consistent with low emissions worlds, futures in which we limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees this century, are slipping out of reach. And that actually, even those low emissions scenarios probably underestimate sea level rise anyway. Most adaptation and coastal management plans use projections summarised by the IPCC, the UN's climate science body that synthesises research into periodic reports. In the last report, we got this figure, which shows expected sea level rise by the end of the century, given several different scenarios of the future that depend on our greenhouse gas emissions. Mostly, these show sea level rise of less than 1 metre by 2100, apart from this dashed line, which shows unlikely but potentially considerable sea level rise. This innocuous line is how they account for the possibility of big changes in sea level related to tipping points like the collapse of the West Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets. The IPCC is known for being slightly conservative, and since the last report, most of the observations and scientific evidence have suggested that we are currently tracking along with the worst-case scenario for ice loss and sea level rise. And what this newer paper suggests is that we're headed for much more sea level rise than the IPCC ever projected for this century. Basically, they're saying what we're all thinking. Those optimistic scenarios ain't happening. The gap between what we're doing and where we need to be is simply too big. Ice sheets and glaciers are just losing too much ice already. Already, we are absolutely not on track to reduce emissions enough to be consistent with 1.5 or 2 degrees by end of the century. At the very best, we're in for 2.6 degrees. The Climate Action Tracker thermometer monitors the policies and pledges of all countries and calculates the average amount of warming that is likely to result from them by 2100. If all countries fully implement every pledge, fully achieve their net zero targets, and move forward with every piece of announced legislation, we will see warming of 1.5 to 2.4 degrees Celsius. That's the optimistic scenario. Given real-world action consistent with current policies, we're in for 2.1 to 3.3 degrees by 2100, and temperatures will continue to rise after that point. That's bad enough already because an average of 2.6 degrees heating will spell disaster for communities already affected by climate change, increasing the number of extreme events and tipping several important climate systems beyond the point of no return. And given the state of global geopolitics, it feels like even that least optimistic scenario will be pretty unachievable. And as a reminder, our actions this decade are what will determine which climate we're saddled with in the middle and end of this century. And well, the world of geopolitics isn't exactly concerned with reducing emissions right now. They'd much rather bomb kids and start unnecessary wars over oil. The authors of the paper put this slightly less provocatively. Besides, achieving those low-end, optimistic scenarios would require some big assumptions. One of them is that carbon-negative technologies would have to be deployed on a scale that is currently pretty unthinkable. And the other is that both of the lowest scenarios assume a population decline that we're just not seeing. And after all these caveats, the authors say that the lower-end projections for sea level rise are actually probably underestimated. Even if, and that's a big if, we could achieve those emissions reductions, the ice sheets would continue to contribute more sea level rise than initially thought. They say with current pathways, sea level rise of 1 or even 2 metres should be planned for this century. And beyond that, well, we've likely committed ourselves to multiple metres of sea level rise purely from our actions to date, never mind the emissions that are still in the pipeline. And even the lowest emissions futures will result in up to 6 metres of sea level rise over the very long term. Those results are also echoed by another new study led by Norwegian researchers, who found that melting below floating Antarctic ice shelves, even ones in relatively cooler East Antarctica, may increase ice loss from the southern continent dramatically. We already know that warming oceans are melting floating Antarctic ice from below. That's having a particularly rapid impact in the western part of the Antarctic. But these researchers have found evidence that warm water is being channeled underneath comparatively cool ice shelves in the East Antarctic. Deep grooves cut into the ice deliver warm water right to the bit of the ice shelf that is anchored to the seabed and create pockets that trap warm water and drive further melting. When ice shelves collapse, it allows the glaciers they previously held back to flow unrestricted into the ocean, which adds to global sea levels. But despite the abundance of evidence showing that we are heading for a world with sea levels tens of meters higher than today's, it's not the main climate impact I actually worry about. Because although sea level rise of the magnitude scientists are increasingly warning about will be coastline altering, this is not the most pressing of our worries. Rising temperatures and humidity are already threatening people's lives today, and with every fraction of a degree, we increase the exposure of ordinary people to harm. People who live in places where summer temperatures are already dangerously high, and those who work outside are especially at risk, as well as the very young, the very old, and those with poor health. Combine that with added humidity, and you have an even more deadly situation, where people's bodies simply can't sweat enough to cool them down. Every fraction of a degree increases the frequency and severity of extreme events like heat waves, droughts, floods, wildfires, and storms. And changing rainfall patterns threaten agriculture and ecosystems, impacting people's lives, livelihoods, and our ability to feed ourselves. Despite these grim conclusions, the authors emphasize the importance of deep, rapid emissions cuts. Although we have more immediate concerns, the threat of sea level rise underlines how long-lasting the impacts of our actions today will be. Curbing emissions delays the inevitable and limits how fast seas rise. It buys us more time to adapt and allows us to put plans in place to help future generations cope with our mess. Besides, it's never too late to make things even a little bit less bad. At this point, I've lost count of how many videos about sea level rise I've released on this channel. But if you want to lean into the tipping point angle to understand where those multi-meter sea level rise predictions come from, then watch this one next. And if you value the work that I do synthesizing the state of scientific literature in easy to understand terms, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon for as little as the price of a coffee each month. You can do that over here. All right, catch you in the next one.